A Thanksgiving service has taken place at Westminster Abbey to mark the 70th anniversary of the arrival in the UK of the Empire Windrush. The Prime Minister Theresa May and families of the Windrush generation have attended the event, which included a reenactment of the arrival on the 22nd of June 1948. Around 500 migrants from the West Indies arrived at Tilbury Docks in Essex to help rebuild post-war Britain and at the same time start a process of social change which irreversibly altered the face of the country. It also launched a national conversation about how migrants into this country should be treated, a debate which continues to this day. We're live to central London, where we can talk more about this with Joseph Ochieno, a former columnist with New African magazine. Joseph, really good to see you. Thanks for joining us today. Your reflections on 70 years since the Windrush generation first arrived in the UK.
It's interesting, Gamal, isn't it? You've just been having a conversation with Mark about the issues to do with separation and reunion of families, if at all. If you look at the Windrush generation and their communities, these are children of African slaves who were forcefully removed from the continent and into the Caribbean. And 70 years ago today, these were the cream of them who were attempting to make a new life in Britain. And I think, just as we're having conversation today about America and Britain, Britain actually lost an opportunity to redeem itself 70 years ago, and they've actually continuously lost an opportunity to redeem themselves up to and including today. And I think the conversation, within the context of a nexus of what we're talking about with Americas today is a confirmation of that. And the reality is this, Gamal, that I think these are human beings, these are not numbers, and what is happening is that the West needs to understand that for generations people have migrated, people have moved, but and at the bottom of this has been actually a process of either an advance for profit, creating migration or forced migration, or in many cases a process of politics and public policy which actually impacts on communities back home. But I hope really going forward that after today, with the kind of conversations we are having, and I note Jeremy Corbyn making some rather sensible observations there, we shall have a review and a debate in the West, but particularly in Britain, so that the grandchildren of the Windrush generation can actually attempt to do what David Lammy indicated, that it is possible to bury the past and try and look forward, but at least forward with a hope.
Yeah, you mentioned public policy there. I mean, how did this generation help to rebuild post-war Britain, would you say?
Well, talk about post-war Britain. Before the post-war Britain, slave labor built this country, and many of the big guys and big names in this country today are actually net beneficiaries of that process. Many of these guys came when there was lack of insufficient labor, and in fact, the irony is that not only did they come into home, but they're basically, people who thought they were coming back into Britain to fill a gap, to skills gap in Britain, whether it's something to do with the health service, to education, to transport, and the various sector. Some of the basic jobs that many of the Brits at the time, some of them today didn't want to do, were filled up and down by these people. So these guys have made huge contribution, and so have the many more contemporary Africans who've actually followed them, and indeed Asians. And Gamal, I have an interesting thought here. I don't know that 70 years ago, people who were voluntarily welcomed here, if you look back into them and you look back to what happened, with the Ugandan Asians maybe 20 or so years later, and you look at the composition of the populations, whether or not, there is something underlying here that we need to be able to address as a community, particularly the British community of nations, meaning the diverse Britain that we know. And by the way, Britain's generally, by and large, is not a bad place to be, where there's diversity, but where there's a conversation. And many of this conversation will have to involve politics, the media like yourselves, and indeed academia.
We've come a long way. It wasn't so, long ago, a few generations ago, where there'd be signs on the streets saying no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. That doesn't exist anymore, thankfully. Yet at the same time, if you look at the figures, black Caribbean students are excluded at 3 times the rate of white students. Black Britons 8 times more likely to be stopped and searched. There is still some work to be done.
Huge amount of work to be done, and you're quite right, we've come a long way. People like Diane Abbott, who were perhaps the then few privileged people who managed to be able to reach Westminster. And it's interesting, about 25 years ago, I recall Diane Abbott had just arrived, was actually warning elements of the Windrush generation, when the asylum and immigration legislation then pushed by the British, rather by the Conservatives, that look, this is not about contemporary immigrants either from Asia or Africa. This has got an underlying things to do with racism, which may just about catch up with you. The interesting thing is, this year, what conversation did we have? We've lost a Home Secretary as a result.
What did the Windrush scandal tell us?
I think that beyond what was founded about institutional racism in the police, and by the way, I lived in New Eltham and I was compelled to move out of New Eltham after the death of Stephen Lawrence, that underlying in society, there is still an element of intrinsic racism. But I think what really is at heart is an open conversation and open debate. I think politicians duck the real issues. I think the British people need to know that they contributed generally to most of the crises that compel people, whether they're people who came via the Caribbean or directly from Africa or direct from India, up to and including the question of the Palestinians, that by and large our foreign policies created these situations, either politically or in many cases a push for profit, like you'd find in the Democratic Republic of Congo or many of the Central and Eastern African countries today.
OK, Joseph, thank you very much for your time. Have a good weekend.